Hi, John Herman here. Today we're going to be concluding our short study on the book of Esther. Hopefully you've had a chance to read it this week, or at least remember what we summarized about the book last week. Here are a few reminders to jog your memories. Esther was a Jewish orphan living in Susa, which was in Persia. Mordecai was Esther's older Jewish cousin and caretaker. King Xerxes was the ruler of Persia at the time. Queen Vashti was Xerxes' first queen, who was deposed. Haman is the villain of the story. He was the king's next in charge, who wanted to annihilate all of the Jews. So, here's a short synopsis just to jog your memory again. King Xerxes deposed Queen Vashti for insubordination. Esther was chosen as her replacement because of her beauty. She did not tell the king her nationality. Her cousin Mordecai refused to bow down to the king's second-in-command, Haman. This infuriated Haman, and he conspired to have the king unknowingly order the destruction of all Jews, not just Mordecai. Coincidentally, the king discovered that Mordecai had earlier saved his life by exposing a plot to kill him. He then honored the very man that Haman had destined to destroy. Esther told the king the truth, and Haman was executed instead of Mordecai. The king then agreed to a plan orchestrated by Mordecai and Esther to save the Jews and at the same time to destroy their enemies. The Jews were thus saved, and the event of their salvation is still celebrated as the holiday of Purim. Now, there's usually more than one way to interpret Scripture, as you know. I think in this case we need to look at the story as a whole, rather than being consumed by some of the details. What is God trying to tell us here? So first I'd like to discuss some of the issues that have generated discussion and may distract from the big picture. One feature of the book is that God is never mentioned, nor is any form of worship or prayer. Martin Luther once said that he wished the book did not exist at all. Of course, just because something is not mentioned does not mean it did not exist. That's up to the reader to decide. Apparently, the people who decided on which books to include in Scripture saw the merit, or should I say were inspired to see the merit. So one question that's always raised is, were Mordecai and Esther devout Jews? On one hand, Esther married a pagan king. She did not worship or pray, at least is not specified in the story. She did not follow Jewish dietary restrictions. Mordecai chose to stay in Persia rather than return to Jerusalem with his people. On the other hand, Esther did not have a choice in becoming part of the king's harem. It is not explicitly stated that she did not pray. It is stated that she fasted for 3 days and requested her people to do the same when the situation looked bleak. Mordecai told Esther, now this is important, that she may have been placed in her position to save her people. Again, this is a key verse in the book. It shows an understanding of God's interaction with his people. As far as Esther's dietary behavior, she might have wanted to conceal her identity by eating as her peers did. Regarding their choices to remain in Persia, remember that Mordecai and Esther had established their roots there because they had been there for most of their lives. Okay, why did Vashti refuse to attend the party? One view is that she did not want to be objectified, parading in front around in front of a bunch of drunken men. She had more class than that and was way ahead of her time with regards to women's lib. What she did took a lot of nerve. Now, another view is that it was her pride that played an issue. In her day and time, wives did not refuse their husbands, and in this case, she humiliated the king in front of his nobles. Why do you suppose Mordecai refused to bow to Haman? One view says that it was his pride. But others argue that maybe he regarded bowing as a form of worship, and that the only one worthy of worship was the one true God of Israel. But either way, he found out about the planned destruction of his people. He did not relent, though, as far as bowing. Does one person's faith justify the destruction of countless innocent people? What would you have done? Let's assume that you did not bow because of religious reasons and not pride. Apparently, God put it in his mind to stick to his guns, and God would work it out. Mordecai even said to Esther in chapter 4, verse 13, after she refused to help at first, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place." Now get that. Relief and deliverance from the Jews, for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? It appears that Mordecai's faith is rather strong, even without the explicit mention of it. Now, I'd like to do a little more background so that the story gets even more interesting. One fact regarding the absence of prayer is that there are 6 additions to the book comprising 107 verses that appear in the Greek translation. They are not found in the original Hebrew version. Some of these verses appear at the point in the story where Mordecai and Esther learn of Haman's decree, and they describe the prayers and supplications of both. Mordecai prays specifically that he refused to bow to Haman, not because of pride, but because he refuses to bow down to anyone but God. He then prays for deliverance for his people. Likewise, Esther not only fasted, as mentioned in the story, but dressed in sackcloth, covered her head with ashes and dung, and humbled herself while praying for deliverance. Why do you think these verses were added? Maybe to try to correct some of the characters' flaws, or change the overall flavor of the book. They were not included in the Latin translation, nor in Luther's German version. Now, here's more food for thought. The Amalekites were enemies of the Jews. They were a wandering tribe who were a constant thorn in Israel's side. Israel's first king, King Saul, was finally successful in driving them from the promised land, but when God told him to completely wipe out the tribe and their livestock, he disobeyed and did not do it. As a result, they continued to contend with the Jews. Now remember, Haman was an Amalekite, and Mordecai, of course, was a Jew, which brings us to the present story. The new decree designed to save the Jews, written by Mordecai and Esther with the king's blessing, does not stop with allowing the Jews to defend themselves. It gives them the right to avenge Haman's decree and to attack and kill anyone who even might want to attack them, including the Amalekites. It's just as bad as Haman's law, but in reverse. The Amalekites are finally exterminated by the Jews as decreed by God many years before. So, is it possible that the entire story, starting with Queen Vashti's disobedience, had been orchestrated by God to finally get the job done? None of the players could have seen it coming, but each had a role to play. God had a plan. Even Esther, who has been looked upon as being vindictive and vengeful when she asked for more time to finish destroying the Amalekites, was really only completing what God had commanded Saul to do. Further, the Jews were not interested in advancing themselves. They were just trying to free themselves from their enemies. Now let's look at some of the coincidences that occurred in the story. First, what's the odds of Mordecai overhearing the soldiers' conversation about killing the king in the first place? As always, God has a plan. It's interesting that when Haman cast the dice, known as the pure, he did so during the first month. The date of his revenge was revealed to be during the last month. This allowed the maximum time for God's plan to be enacted. In chapter 6 and if chapter 6 and 7 don't show the hand of God, I don't know what does. I believe the string of events that rapidly occur are no coincidences. All occurred within one day. We have the following. First, King Xerxes couldn't fall asleep, so he reads a history of his reign. He finds out about Mordecai not being rewarded for saving his life. Haman walks in to request Mordecai's execution just as the king is contemplating a reward for Mordecai. Haman goes home upset about what the king will do if he finds out about the decree. At that moment, he is escorted to the second fateful banquet. After being accused by Esther, the king leaves in a moment of rage, at which time Haman falls down on her couch to beg for mercy. The king returns just at that moment and accuses him of molesting his wife. Finally, a eunuch happens to be standing there and tells the king of a newly erected gallows on which Haman is strung. This sounds like something out of a movie script. The timing is almost too perfect to believe unless you consider God's involvement. So, what are some life lessons that we can get out of this whole story? We don't know how Esther felt about being thrust into her new role as queen, but we do know that her position allowed the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan. Mordecai realized that truth and reminded her of it when he told her that she might have been placed there for a reason. In our lives, sometimes we find ourselves in places we hadn't planned on being. Instead of complaining and being disappointed, maybe we should rely on our faith that God has an ultimate plan for us, and that maybe one day it will become apparent. Now, let's consider Haman's pride for a moment. In the book of Proverbs it says, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." Haman rises to a high in his opinion of himself, but boy does he ever fall. Is there a life lesson for us here? Also regard Psalm 7, which says, "Whoever digs a hole for someone else and scoops it out falls into the pit that they have made. The trouble they cause recoils on them. Their violence comes down on their own heads." Now consider Esther. She was very beautiful. However, she was humble and did not think she was better than everyone else because of it. We see how each of them wound up. What's the life lesson regarding pride? What's the lesson regarding our desire to harm someone for our benefit, including our tacit desire for someone's failure, which would not which would benefit us. So it's just even the thought of someone else's failure falls into this category of wishing harm on someone else for our benefit. Why did Esther not immediately make her request of Xerxes? She put him off twice. Maybe she was waiting for the right moment, or maybe she was just scared. She knew two things. The men liked to drink, and that might work in her favor. Also, she knew it would take a miracle. The timing had to be just right in her mind. Who knows but that God did not place in her mind her next course of action so that his plan could be achieved. A life lesson here? When we perceive God telling us something or leading us in a certain direction, then listen, have faith, and then act. As the commercial says, just do it. Esther and Mordecai were ordinary people. There is no mention of any outstanding accomplishments or of any extraordinary piety to God in the book. Yet God had a use for them. Do you consider yourself ordinary? God has a plan for you, too. Now, I'd like to mention a little bit about the holiday of Purim, which, as we said before, is still in existence today, still celebrated. It was initially instigated as a celebration for the Jews' deliverance. When the Jews celebrate it even today, there's no mention of God as facilitating the rescue of the Jews. It's a holiday created by people for people. It's unlike any other Jewish holiday, such as Passover, Yom Kippur, and Hanukkah, all of which in some form regard God and what he has done for his people. There are no sacrifices, no references to God, to God's deeds, to his character or his word. There's no worship, only celebration with a carnival-like atmosphere. Some of the practices of Purim include: 1. After the reading of the book of Esther at the synagogue, the commandment is carried out in which the Jews are to get drunk to the point that they cannot tell the difference between "Cursed be Haman" and "Blessed be Mordecai." Afterwards, there's a feast. Plays and skits are performed in which fun is poked at the school, the teachers, the rabbis, and to portions of Scripture that are normally held in reverence. Another feature is that the Jews are commanded to give to the needy during this time. So, what is the final message of Esther? Think about it. The purpose of the book of Esther is to display the providence of God. The specific example presented here demonstrates God's desire to save his chosen people. His plan is carried out using the lives of certain ordinary people. But the book teaches all of us that God is constantly working in our lives through events that will ultimately result in the fulfillment of his will. Keep your antennas up so you can respond to requests from God, even if they might not make perfect sense at the time.